Hey guys, so today we are looking at another epic history video. This one's about the Suez crisis. We're looking at the all parts one because I believe the original one was two parts. We're looking at the full one, and yeah, if I remember correctly, the way this conflict's usually described, or at least how it was kind of pitched to me, was essentially this was kind of like the end of the dominance of the UK and France as kind of like these huge, like almost world dictating powers in a sense. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I'm really looking forward to seeing if the way that was described to me hopefully rings true or not. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I don't really have much to say other than I really want to get to it. So before I do, I need to say that if you want to see the original video without me here in the corner or yapping, the link to this video is down in the description down below. And sorry, I just read something in the text. And if you enjoy my channel and my content and want to help support me in any way, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It would really help my small but humble channel grow, and I would appreciate it very much. With that said, and now without any further ado, let's get to it, shall we? Let's watch the Suez Crisis, all parts by Epic History.
In 1956, a dispute over the Suez Canal in Egypt led to international crisis and war. Two fading colonial powers, Britain and France, expected an easy victory over Egypt, but were forced into a humiliating withdrawal as the world's new superpowers flexed their muscles.
Wow.
It was a stark sign that the age of European imperialism was over, and that a new international order had taken its place. Little remembered today, the events of 1956 had huge consequences for Britain and France, the Arab world, Israel, and the United States of America.
Okay, so the description I got for this crisis was pretty accurate, at least in terms of like France and the UK kind of losing their power, because like let's not forget how powerful the French and the UK were, especially in like, their colonialism and whatnot. So this seems like a big indicator of their loss of power, which happens to no one can stay on top forever, right, in the world. That's kind of how like all empires are, and I really it'll happen to every powerful nation. I think with the passage of time, it's just like no one stays the peak of power forever. That's just the way the world goes, Oh yeah, it's really interesting to see anything about America because of how much I try to avoid America on this channel. And it's not because I hate American history, I'm actually a huge fan. I obviously am American, I know, we study it. I think it's just like I said in the past, I try not to cover American history on this channel or anything too related to America. I don't know, I kind of stepping outside of my own, nation. As you know, I've hardly ever covered anything from, this continent or America, but, yeah, now I'm starting to slowly seep in there. So, yeah.
This is the story of the Suez Crisis, whose fallout shaped world affairs for decades to come. In 1869, world navigation was transformed by the opening of the Suez Canal. This 100-mile man-made waterway through the Egyptian desert cut 5,000 miles off the voyage from Europe to Asia, as ships no longer had to sail around Africa. Its construction, overseen by French diplomat Ferdinand de Lesseps, had taken 10 years and cost the lives of many thousands of Egyptian labourers. The Suez Canal Company, which owned and ran the canal, was a private company owned by its shareholders, including French, Austrian and Russian investors, as well as the ruler or Khedive of Egypt.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Though Egypt was technically a vassal for the Ottomans, near the decline of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt eventually became so powerful that they, straight up were threatening the Ottomans at one point. The rest of the great powers of Europe had to actually step in to settle the dispute because Egypt was making headway to the main part of Anatolia to threaten the Ottoman Empire at its heart. So, it goes to show you just the decline of the Ottomans, especially around pre-World War One, and just how Egypt, which was technically a part of it, then kind of more vassalized in a sense, kind of just started rising in its own power, And obviously the opening of this canal was a pretty big one, and because that made the rest of the powers of Europe like, well, now we're gonna get involved here because we have a stake. And obviously, why wouldn't you, right? The trade benefits, not having to go all the way around Africa, but through just here. It's very advantageous, so you can see why they just started getting involved, and kind of without the Ottomans, how do you say, input so much? So yeah.
Ismail Pasha. In 1875, to pay off his mountainous debts, the Khedive sold his 44% share in the canal company to the British government. As the world's greatest imperial and naval power, Britain had initially opposed the canal, seeing it as a potential threat, but soon proved to be its greatest beneficiary. 80% of the ships that used the canal were British, and it became a vital link to the British Empire's eastern colonies, and the jewel in the crown, India. Control of the canal and the security of Egypt became a vital British strategic concern. In 1882, when Egyptian anger at European interference in their country exploded into a nationalist revolt, led by Colonel Ahmad Urabi, the British sent a military force to intervene. The Egyptian army was swept aside, and Egypt effectively became a British protectorate for the next 60 years. British control of the Suez Canal was a major strategic advantage in both world wars. But in the wake of victory in World War II, the British Empire was in retreat. India, Pakistan and Burma gained their independence. There were revolts against British rule in Malaya, Kenya and Cyprus. Egypt had received formal independence in 1922, but Britain continued to station troops there and govern much of the country's affairs. Only in 1947 did British troops withdraw to the so-called Canal Zone, under an earlier deal with Egypt's King Farouk, that the British could keep bases there until 1956. But Egyptians were turning against Farouk. They blamed him for failing to prevent the creation of the Jewish state of Israel, and for Egypt's defeat in the Arab-Israeli War that had followed. They also blamed King Farouk for allowing British troops to remain in Egypt. In the Canal Zone, British soldiers and civilians came under attack from the increasingly hostile local population, with riots, arson and gun battles, leading the British to impose martial law. By 1952, a group of nationalist Egyptian army officers, known as the Free Officers Movement, had had enough. They seized power in a military coup. King Farouk was forced to abdicate and went to live out a luxurious exile in Italy. The following year, Egypt was declared a republic. Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as the new leader and president of Egypt. A committed and charismatic Arab nationalist, determined to free Egypt from foreign influence.
This is how a typical video editor works.
Okay, Nasser is playing East off against West until the last moment.
In the 1950s, America and the West were engaged in a standoff with the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War.
Yep, the Cold War. So there are several things I want to quickly comment on. The 20th century is such an interesting time in terms of just how much change and how close it is, you know, to us. Obviously, it's literally the last century, and you know, from between the fall of kind of the monarchies and empires of the world, you know, between how influential the British Empire was, literally the largest empire man had ever seen, and then just shrunk back to mainly being relegated back to, you know, its homeland, home borders, and, you know, the fall of many monarchs and empires like the Ottomans and Imperial Russia, and the rise of republics, and kind of a big decline in colonialism. Is like so much of the systems that had lasted for centuries before just kind of crumbled so much, and you know, if not outright disappeared. And I just find that such an interesting time that all happened, you know. And you can kind of even see it like now, like for centuries the UK was just, yeah, we can just take what we need. And obviously, I think we're going to see more in depth in this video just how that doesn't work for them, or kind of stops working. And, yeah, another big part is just how important Egypt is. Egypt is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, like top 5, up there with China and several others. Oldest that are still around. And we've seen it through so many history videos, just how coveted Egypt has been for the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, and just how it's always cited to be like either the breadbasket or a culturally rich place, or even here, just the geography of the Suez Canal, and now how coveted it is by like big empires like the UK. It's like, it's such an ancient land, and even to like modern day, almost like modern day, just how important it is for the world. It really is insane when you put it in perspective just how old Egypt is and how important and relevant of a territory it's remained basically since, like, as far as we can think in history. Like, Egypt is just such a historically rich place, you know what I mean? I feel like sorry. So like, I don't know. It's kind of amazing that I feel like it's a place that, oddly enough, in history videos we watch, it's always mentioned, but it's never the main focus. You think like probably more historian YouTubers want to cover it because you could go forever. Like, Egypt is just that old. Like, one of my favorite sayings is that by the time of like Cleopatra was closer to our time than she was to the founding of the pyramids. Something like that, just kind of put to perspective how old it is. You know, even times when we thought we're ancient like that, it's like, no, even Egypt's just older than that. So, I don't know. You get what I mean? I'm just kind of like admiring the land. And, again, we're really close to our modern time. Yeah.
A so-called Iron Curtain divided Europe between communist East and capitalist West. Around the world, each side tried to win friends and limit the other's influence. Egypt, the largest and most powerful Arab state, would be a valuable prize for either side. But which way would President Nasser turn? US President Dwight D. Eisenhower wanted to win over Nasser, but couldn't grant his request for a major arms deal. They'd most likely be used against Israel, which had many supporters in the US. The US and Britain instead offered to fund construction of the Aswan Dam, the centerpiece of Nasser's plan to modernize the Egyptian economy. Britain also agreed to remove its troops from the Suez Canal zone by June 1956. But then, border tension between Israel and her neighbors boiled over as the Israeli army attacked Egyptian-controlled Gaza, killing 38 Egyptian soldiers. The Gaza raid made Nasser determined to rapidly strengthen and modernize Egypt's army. Since the US wouldn't help, Nasser turned to the Soviet bloc and signed a major deal to purchase modern tanks and aircraft from communist Czechoslovakia. The deal was seen as a huge triumph across the Arab world. Nasser further antagonized America by establishing diplomatic relations with communist China.
Dang, NASA. Yeah, NASA's making some serious chess moves there. The Cold War era is quite frankly such an interesting era, because obviously I think you've heard the saying that if America and the Soviets had straight up fought each other, they would have ended the world. So it's like, because, you know, nukes and all that, and the atomic bomb. So instead of a direct fight, they basically, it's known for its proxy wars, right? Like the Korean War, Vietnam, as America was like, we need to stop communism, and so we're going to fight them. And it kind of gives me the image of like two people playing chess, but except it's two nations playing, and the chess pieces are smaller ones as they're kind of moving them around. Again, the Cold War era, such an interesting era for that. Because the war, I know I've said like all wars kind of like a chess game, but this one especially was basically a chess game between ideologies, right, of the communism and capitalism and, you know, all that, all the way till, yeah, the decline of the Soviet Union and its fall in the 90s. So, yeah, just overall really interesting war. I remember covering it a lot. Like in high school, we covered it in our sophomore year, and you know, I remember being interested in it even then. So yeah.
For Eisenhower, chasing an alliance with Nasser was proving a major headache, and the US and British offer to fund the Aswan Dam was withdrawn. It was a move that would prove to have serious global repercussions that neither Britain nor America ever saw coming.
Tonight, our Egyptian canal will be run by Egyptians.
On the 26th of July, 1956, Nasser stunned the world by announcing that with immediate effect, Egypt would nationalize the Suez Canal Company. We dug the canal with our lives, our skulls, our bones, our blood, he declared. The money is ours, and the Suez Canal belongs to us. We shall build the Aswan Dam our own way. If Britain and America would not fund the dam, Nasser intended to fund it himself with profits from the Suez Canal Company. His speech received an ecstatic response from the people of Egypt.
You know, yeah, I have to give it to Nasser. He is an interesting figure. He does radiate charisma, and like you could see why the people love him, right? Even just watching these like videos and seeing him, the man is radiating charisma. And again, like, basically just saying get them the heck out, Egypt for the Egyptians. And it's, yeah, yeah, basically get the outsiders out. Like, it's a huge part of it, especially in the canal area. And yeah, it's just very interesting. Like, he's a really interesting guy. He's like kind of like making these big moves between the two global superpowers and trying to get something out of it for himself. Like, again, like, very interesting guy. Gosh darn it.
Nasser's move was entirely legal. The company's shareholders would be bought out at fair prices. Yet his decision would trigger an international crisis, war, and a new era in the balance of world power. In Britain, Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden responded with fury to what he saw as a major attack on British national interests. 15,000 ships a year came through the Suez Canal. And from the Middle East, they brought a vital resource that the British economy couldn't survive without.
Through it travels today about half the oil without which the industry of this country, of Western Europe, of Scandinavia, and of many other countries too, couldn't keep going. This is a matter of life and death to us all.
Nasser, as Eden put it, had his thumb on our windpipe. As Britain's Foreign Secretary in the 1930s and World War II, Eden had made his reputation by opposing appeasement, the policy of trying to maintain peace by giving in to the demands of dictators. But now, with poor health and frayed nerves clouding his judgment, he convinced himself that Nasser was another Hitler or Mussolini, an Arab dictator that Britain had to face down. The Egyptian president, he decided, would have to go.
Oh boy, the tensions are escalating. They're very palpable here. Like I said, I like covering older points of history. I don't like kind of getting too close to the modern era, mainly because, well, there's a lot of tension with certain stuff, especially around the Middle East, as you can tell, and like, high thoughts and opinions that I think, like, I'd rather never get into. That's why I kind of like covering older eras of history and like kind of staying away from more modern stuff. Like, I try to stay out of the 20th century, but again, like I said, I'm leaning in because, there are people who do want me to look at this, and by all means, I do try to listen. But I'll say though, one thing I do like is definitely just, we have videos, like we can just play of these, historical figures. Feels weird to call them that, especially since they're so close, but yeah, they are, these historical figures, and like, we can see photos of them and videos and like even hear them speak. It's really cool, Maybe with the advancement of AI, we can do that for like older points of history. Just have AI Julius Caesar talk about stuff. Man, you think like historical YouTubers are gonna like use? I mean, we've seen some, like with the House of History by Frederick the Great. Like, some of the portraits were AI. So, like, you think in the future, like, historical YouTubers are just gonna start utilizing AI to try to bring it more to life? Oh, that'd be interesting. Though I do know AI is quite controversial. There are people who are like, well, we can use it, and there are those who are like, oh heck no, get AI out of here. We hate AI. Like in my school, the I won't get into it. That's a long side story. But yeah, that's just a thought I had.
French Prime Minister Guy Mollet agreed with Eaton's assessment. He had an additional reason to want Nasser gone. France was fighting a bitter war in its African colony of Algeria against nationalist rebels, trained and supplied by Nasser. Britain and France now secretly began planning a military operation to seize control of the Suez Canal, remove Nasser from power, and reaffirm their status as major global powers. That summer, under pressure from the Americans, Eden agreed to host an international conference in a last effort to find a peaceful solution to the crisis.
Lancaster House, London, naturally attracted quite a crowd on the opening day of the Suez Conference. 22 nations were represented. Only 2 countries, Egypt and Greece, had declined the invitation to the fateful meeting.
18 of the 22 nations supported Britain and France's position that the Suez Canal be returned to international ownership. A proposal turned down flat by President Nasser. US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles told the British that nevertheless, America would not support an attack on Egypt. Dulles strongly believed that military action against Nasser would push the entire Arab world into the arms of the Soviets. Besides, President Eisenhower was running for re-election and would not welcome the distraction. It was a warning that Eden fatefully ignored. Britain and France had already chosen the path to war.
Okay, October 1956 was one of the craziest months in history. Well, that's quite the tall order. We've seen a lot of crazy months in history.
But it was not Britain or France that struck first against Nasser. It was Israel. On the 29th of October, Israeli paratroopers landed in the Egyptian Sinai, seizing the strategic Mitla Pass and paving the way for an invasion by ground forces. At the UN, Israel insisted it was acting in self-defense against raids by Palestinian fighters known as Fedayeen, operating from bases in Gaza and Sinai.
Determined to wipe out the bases in the Sinai wilderness from which murder and death and destruction are launched again.
But there were no Fedayeen bases in Sinai. Britain and France, claiming to be acting on behalf of the international community, issued an ultimatum to both sides. Stop fighting within 12 hours and withdraw all forces 10 miles from the Suez Canal, or they would intervene to enforce compliance. Egypt was effectively being told to abandon the Sinai and the canal. Israel accepted the terms. Nasser refused. So on the 31st of October, British and French aircraft, taking off from carriers in the Mediterranean and bases in Cyprus and Malta, began bombing Egyptian airfields, air defenses and infrastructure. But not all was as it seemed. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion had been considering an attack on Egypt for many months. He was encouraged by Moshe Dayan, the hawkish commander of Israel's armed forces. Nasser, like all leaders of Arab states, did not view the new Jewish state as legitimate. Now receiving modern weapons from Czechoslovakia, he was seen as a potential threat to Israel's survival. They were also determined to end Egypt's blockade of the Straits of Tiran, which prevented Israeli access to the Red Sea and limited opportunities for trade. France wanted to ally with the Israelis to get rid of Nasser, but British Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden was anxious about being seen as the aggressor. So the French came up with an idea. At Sèvres, near Paris, representatives of Britain, France and Israel met in secret to plan a war. Israel would invade Egypt, allowing Britain and France, posing as peacemakers, to issue an ultimatum they knew only Israel would accept. Then, claiming to be acting to safeguard the canal, they would invade Egypt and overthrow Nasser. Though they had...
Wow, that's devious. This plotting, though. Dang, man. I'm waiting for the moment that they get, like, cooked, because the way Epic History... The way this was described to me, and the way Epic History has, like, proposed it, yeah, I'm, like, almost waiting for the moment. It sounds like it's priming for, like, Britain and France to have a major, like, you know, like, this is all gonna backfire on them. So, I'm, like, waiting for the moment that they get cooked, essentially, and everything falls apart. But, man, this whole plotting stuff's very, very devious, you know?
no real plan for what to do once he was gone.
Yeah, we'll wing that part, you know? But, yeah, that's kind of the thing. Okay, you take the... You take out NASA, you essentially get Egypt to yourself? You're just gonna take over it? I guess try to rule it under your occupation, essentially. You know? That's what I'm guessing they're gonna go for, but yeah, I would imagine, like, the natives wouldn't be happy. There'd probably be a lot of, like, coups and, like, revolts after that. So yeah, I feel like that's a pretty big one that they should have had an idea of, or at least try to come up with one. Yeah.
It would take years for the full details of this conspiracy to emerge.
We are a proud nation.
On the 5th of November, after a week of bombing, and with Israeli troops winning the battle in Sinai, British and French paratroopers were dropped onto targets around Port Said and Port Fuad at the mouth of the Suez Canal. Once on the ground, they quickly seized Egyptian airfields and key infrastructure. The next morning, under cover of airstrikes and naval bombardment, British and French landings began. Fierce street fighting raged throughout the day, but the Egyptians were massively outgunned, and it proved a one-sided contest. Around 600 Egyptian soldiers and police were killed. British and French deaths totaled just 26.
Wow.
Egyptian civilians suffered most. Up to 1,000 lost their lives, with many more left homeless by air raids and shelling. By the end of the day, the British and French were in control. But they couldn't prevent the Egyptians sabotaging the Suez Canal itself. They sank ships in its narrow channel, blocking the canal and putting it out of action for several months.
The Arabs will not stand alone. That makes sense, at least in terms of a militaristic aspect, that, like, being jumped by not only Israel, but France and Britain would kind of not be a fair fight. But now it's like, this is the part that, like, even if they have control, like, they don't seem to have a long-term plan, like it's previously mentioned. So I'm wondering if this is where things start getting a little dicey, you know?
It wasn't hard to see that the British, French and Israelis were working together. And at the United Nations, world opinion quickly turned against them. For once,
Yeah, they thought they were all slick with that plan, huh? They were like, alright, you attack, we're gonna look like we're the good guys by stopping them. But now everyone saw that, was like, stop the cap! They thought they were all smooth and stuff, but nah, you ain't slick, Britain and France. People saw right through your ruse. Okay, that was a devious ruse though, like legit though.
the US and Soviet Union were united in condemnation. A typically
tisk.
animated Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, even threatened to fire rockets at Paris and London. President Eisenhower thought the invasion had no moral or legal justification, and he was furious with his British ally for going behind his back.
The British and French governments delivered a 12-hour ultimatum to Israel and Egypt, now followed up by armed attack against Egypt. The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. As it is the manifest right of any of these nations to take such decisions and actions, it is likewise our right, if our judgment so dictates, for we do not accept the use of force as a wise or proper instrument for the settlement of international disputes.
Eisenhower wanted international attention focused on Hungary, where Soviet troops were, at that moment, brutally crushing a popular uprising. Instead, Britain and France's reckless intervention was likely to push Arab states closer to the Soviet Union. In the UN Security Council, Britain and France used their veto to block resolutions that criticized Israel's attack on Egypt, or their own intervention.
Dang.
But with both world superpowers condemning their attack, they now faced a vote in the General Assembly and the threat of UN sanctions. Britain's economy had been fragile before the crisis began. Now, market fears caused the British currency to crash, threatening economic disaster. Only a massive loan from the International Monetary Fund could save Britain, but Eisenhower blocked any IMF aid until Britain agreed to a UN-backed ceasefire in Egypt.
Wow.
Eden, facing growing opposition abroad, at home and from within his own government, had few options. Just 2 days after British troops landed in Egypt, they announced a ceasefire. The French, abandoned by their ally, had no choice but to follow suit. Within days, the UN's first major peacekeeping operation got underway, as Danish UN troops arrived in Egypt to take over from the British and French. As they packed up and re-embarked on their landing ships to return home, it was officially job well done. But in truth, Suez had been a humiliating fiasco. The political leadership had been reckless, the military objectives confused, and as soon as international pressure had mounted up, the British had had no option but to abort the entire mission.
Yeah, that's a really big, like, that's not, I said, like, when you think of, like, how influential the British were, and the French in like world affairs, and now here essentially being told by the world back off, and them having no choice but to like kind of leave with their tail in between their legs, as it were. That is a pretty big moment. Like, obviously, when you just think of like how powerful these two nations were, and now just seeing them, yeah, essentially get told off by everyone, that kind of goes to show the dramatic shift of power, right? Like, back then, yeah, colonialism, and back then they would just take stuff, and that would be that. They would hold it. It didn't work this time, and it probably won't ever work again in that sense, so not like the old days. So yeah, like that is a really big, especially when you think of like the history of these countries, like a really big moment.
That winter, under intense American pressure, Israeli forces also withdrew from Sinai.
An act of disastrous folly whose tragic consequences we shall regret for years.
The Suez Crisis forced Britain and France to accept that they were now second-rank powers. No longer could they act as they wished on the world stage, without first considering the view of the United States. The lesson taken by the British was never again to jeopardize their so-called special relationship with America.
Wow.
For France, the lesson was that Britain and America were unreliable allies, and their interests were better served by closer ties within Europe. Israel achieved some objectives, including the opening of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. But with Nasser still in power, future conflict with Egypt and its other Arab neighbours was almost certain. The Sinai War proved to be a precursor to the far more decisive Six-Day War, fought a decade later. British Prime Minister Sir Anthony Eden's career and health were ruined. He resigned, but not before lying to Parliament about his knowledge of the secret deal with Israel.
I wish my successor all good fortune. And Godspeed to you all. Goodbye. Thank you very much.
President Nasser, fated as the hero of the Arab world for having stood up to European imperialists, had in reality been saved by US and UN intervention. But his modernizing reforms, championing of the Arab cause, and opposition to foreign intervention mean his memory is still revered by Arabs across the Middle East. The impact of the Suez Crisis on America was perhaps the most far-reaching. The collapse of British and French prestige amongst Arab nations meant the US would now take the lead in countering Soviet expansion in the Middle East and securing the West's oil supplies. The Suez Crisis would accelerate US involvement in this volatile region. The consequences would stretch well into the 21st century.
Clarifying debate over a possible war in Iraq has given an added sense of urgency to their mission.
Join the
So that was a really great video to see, and again, there's the consequences that are still felt. Again, the Middle East and that region is still a very hot topic, even to this day. You know, some things never really change in that regard. But yeah, it is kind of interesting that that's kind of the end of, like, French and UK prestige, like, compared to what they once were, right, in the world stage, as basically some of the superpowers of the world, and essentially kind of having to be humbled. It really is just kind of like an end of an era kind of moment in history, you know? Like I said, the 20th century, man, it was such a unique change compared to the centuries previous. It really is interesting, though, and also the two world wars taking place, like, so much happened last century, right? Like, wow. Just thinking about it, really, like, wow, it happened so close to us, literally. Like, some people who were alive then still are kicking her now, and, you know, it's cool to think, you know, we're living history. And also frightening, because at least when we see the stuff that happens back then, it's like, well, that happened a long time ago, you know? I like to think we've come far. And then you see stuff like that happens like literally last century, like, oh yeah, no. We're still humanity is even more dangerous than ever. So I don't know. I try not to think too much about the negatives and stuff, but it is frightening and important to learn, as all history kind of is. Well, maybe not the frightening part, but important to learn is what I meant. So yeah, I'm gonna end the video right here, and we'll cover something tomorrow. Bye, everyone.